Hello, Pentax Tips here. Our story starts off in the year 1919 in Tokyo, Japan, where Pentax can trace their roots with the founding of the Asahi Optical Joint Stock Company. The original company just manufactured optics, no camera bodies yet. They began by manufacturing lenses for eyeglasses, binoculars, and even manufactured Japan's first ever movie projector lenses. Asahi became very well known for their glass polishing and lens coatings, which improved light transmissivity of their glass. By 1931, they progressed to producing camera lenses, but these lenses would be manufactured for other companies, one of which was the Perlette, a folding camera made by a company which would later become known as Konica Minolta, another giant in Japanese optics. In 1937, Japan began preparing for the onset of World War II. All lens factories were forced to transition to producing military optics such as periscopes, bomb sights, binoculars, and other lenses. In 1938, the Asahi Optical Company was founded in an attempt to continue manufacturing lenses for consumer cameras. However, they too were swept up in the demand to produce optics for the Japanese army. World War II begins in 1939 and continues for 6 bloody years. Asahi's factories were destroyed, and they lost many important personnel and documentation by the intense bombing raids in Japan. Following the Japanese surrender and the American occupation of Japan in 1945, the Asahi Optical Company was allowed to regroup and continue producing optics. The occupying forces were impressed with the high-quality results, and shortly after, the US Army contracted Asahi to make their binoculars. This was instrumental for getting the company back up and running after the war. Altogether, high-quality Japanese optics became famous internationally as a whole. By the late 1940s, 35mm film was becoming extremely popular for a camera format, and the Asahi Optical Company decided to begin designing their own 35mm cameras. No longer were they going to only be a simple lens manufacturer. At the time, most Japanese companies were producing cheaper knockoffs of the German Leica's rangefinder design. Asahi decided to try something different, and instead utilized what they believed was a superior design with the single lens reflex, similar to that of the very early Italian Rectiflex design and the German-made Practiflex and Contax cameras. However, there were issues with the very early single-lens reflexes. Rangefinders had a strict advantage over single-lens reflex cameras. Mirror blackout caused SLRs to lose sight of their subject during image acquisition, but Asahi had an ace up their sleeve and aimed to solve this problem.
In 1952, the Asahi Flex was officially released. The Asahi Flex was the first single-lens reflex manufactured in Japan. These cameras used an M37 screw mount, similar to the Leica cameras, but also used a pop-up waist-level viewfinder in addition to offering the basic eye-level finder. The camera featured a max shutter speed of 1/500th of a second and a minimum shutter speed of 1/20th of a second. This camera is a beautiful piece of machinery. It has a lovely and thoughtful compact design with an incredible pop-up waist-level viewfinder. You can swing this magnifier open to help check your focus. It's simply amazing seeing the 3D pop using a waist-level finder. This camera also partially solved the mirror blackout issue we mentioned earlier. However, you'd still have to release the shutter button to reset the mirror. Also in the early 50s, the M37 mount Tachymars were released, including this standard lens we have displayed with the 50mm f3.5. These were the first lenses introduced for the Asahi Flex. As for the name Tachymar, it is thought to be inspired by the Asahi founder's brother Takuma Kajiwara, a famous studio and portrait photographer in the United States. Another contributing factor to Asahi's growing popularity during this time were the conflicts happening in Southeast Asia. The Korean War increased the demand for photojournalism and reporting, which in turn bolstered the demand for Asahi's cameras and optics. The Asahi Flex 1A was released the following year in 1953. Although this camera, and the few Asahi Flex released afterward, have no model number designation displayed on the body, the models can be easily identified by their features and how they operate. This camera was nearly exactly the same as the original Asahi Flex, except the minimum shutter speed had been increased to the more expected 1/25th of a second, and it had added flash sync ports. Impressively, Asahi landed a deal with Sears Roebuck to distribute the Asahi Flex 1A in the US. However, those cameras sold in the US would be released under the name Tower, such as the Tower 26. At the time, Sears was the largest and most popular department store in the US, making this deal instrumental in the growing popularity of Asahi. Sears would be their main international supplier for years to come. In 1954, the Asahi Flex 2B was released. This camera would cause a paradigm shift in the photographic world. It almost entirely solved the mirror blackout problem for single-lens reflex cameras with its spring-loaded instant return mirror. With just the briefest moment of blackout remaining, the spring-loaded mirror would automatically reset itself, ready for your next shot. This allowed photographers to track moving subjects through the viewfinder. This new innovation took the market by storm, and Asahi became known as a major camera and lens manufacturer. Two model variations were eventually manufactured of the 2B. We actually exhibit the later model number 2 here, where a round plate covers a port on the shutter side's front panel. The first model of the 2B didn't actually have this port cover. That port would be fitted with the dial in a subsequent camera that sold alongside this model. More on that when we discuss the Asahi Flex 2A. The Asahi Flex 2B was exported and sold on a very large scale, including the Sears release of the Tower 23 and 24. Again, this was a key deal for Asahi, as Sears was a very important American retailer. On display here, we show the Tower 23, an Asahi Flex 2B equivalent, but of the earlier model number 1, without that front panel port cover. In the mid-1950s, the Asahi Flex 2A was released. The Asahi Flex 2A was actually released after the 2B, but also sold simultaneously alongside the 2B, with the only difference being the addition of a slow shutter release dial on the front of the body. This meant the slowest selected shutter speed increased to half a second for longer exposures. The main dial would have to be set to 1/25th of a second, which would then activate the second dial and allow you to access the slower shutter speeds. The Asahi Flex 2A would sell as a premium offering with that slow shutter speed option, while the 2B would be sold alongside as a more affordable option without the front panel second shutter dial.
The Pentax trademark was first filed by Asahi Optical in September of 1952, but was only registered in August of 1955 because the filing had to face the opposition of a third party, probably from Zeiss Icon, that had used the Pentax name in 1954 for a prototype camera. However, in 1955, the company Asahi Pentax Corporation is established in Japan. For Asahi's next camera, they decided to couple its new instant return mirror mechanism along with a very popular M42 screw mount, originally invented by Praktica. The camera is called the Asahi Pentax, or more commonly known as the Pentax AP, with their first ever pentaprism viewfinder single lens reflex. This was the first camera to combine eye-level, through-the-lens focusing, an instant return mirror, and a right-hand film advance lever instead of a rotating knob. Similar to the Asahi Flex series, the AP has the flash port and sync ports located on the front panel next to the mirror box. With these cameras, you can see the shutter speed is still set across two dials for the slower and faster speeds. The first series of the Asahi M42 lenses were also called Tachymar, such as the 55mm f2.2 we have here. In addition, Pentax releases various adapters to accommodate size and pitch differences between the M42 and the M37 mounts. With the 1957 Tachymar 35mm f4, Pentax was the first producer to solve the lens limitations of a wide-angle lens on a single-lens reflex. This would be Japan's first ever single-lens reflex wide-angle lens. Previously, wide-angle lenses required too much room within the camera box to resolve images. The Tachymar 35mm f4 was the first to solve this problem by creating small, compact features and incorporating a newly patented retro focus design. These cameras were heavily marketed and well received, again being distributed by Sears in the US under the Tower name. About a year later, the Pentax S was released, and that was nearly identical to the AP. However, the shutter speeds were changed to be more mathematically correct and the ASA lettering was printed instead of engraved. However, this series had an exceptionally short production run, as the following camera contained another major advancement. The unique Pentax K was released shortly after in 1958. The K is rumored to stand for King, or Kilo, for being Pentax's first camera to sport a maximum shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second. That 1/1000th of a second is really important. This max shutter speed would remain a physical limitation for decades to come. So to have a model capable of this impressive mechanical plateau so early on is impressive. This camera was also equipped with a new micro-split image focusing screen. The Pentax K, probably most importantly, contained an aperture actuating bar in the camera box. This bar would press the pin on the back of the new tachymar lenses. These lenses were the first set of the auto tachymars, which, despite the name, had semi-automatic apertures. The aperture would have to be manually cocked back to allow for wide open focusing. Then when the shutter was released, the pin on the back would simultaneously be pressed by the camera's actuator, instantly stopping down the lens. Semi-automatic because it would have to be recocked for your next shot. This release reflected the photography market's shift from preset aperture lenses to automatic push-pin aperture lenses. In 1959, the symbolic Asahi Pentax logo is established. Asahi in Japanese means rising sun or morning sun, and this symbolism is seen in the original logo, also resembling a king's crown. Next, Asahi released the S2. Also, a new US importer, the Heelan division of the Honeywell Corporation, began distributing the H2 to the American public. These multiple identical models would be a theme for the rest of the series. This would be the US distributor for nearly all Pentax models going up into the mid-1970s. Notably, the dual shutter speed dials are now located as a single dial on top. The S2 may only have had a max shutter speed of 1/500th of a second, but therefore was more affordable and could be more easily mass-produced.
At the 1960 Photokina, Pentax displayed 3 prototype cameras. First, the Pentax Metallica. Equipped with a built-in light meter, which likely used the more common selenium cell light meter, it would meter the entire scene with an equivalent coverage of that of a standard lens. It featured a full metal shutter capable of a speed sync of 1/125th of a second. Next, the Pentax S3, an upgrade from the previous Pentax S2, is an M42 mount camera, which featured mainly an all-new focusing screen called a cross-micro aerial image finder. This greatly assisted with a photographer's manual focusing and seeing when their subject was in focus. Last, but certainly not least, Pentax teased a prototype Spotmatic camera. The name Spotmatic comes from a built-in center point focusing area using a narrow portion of the image seen. This was the world's first through-the-lens spot metering. The all-new cadmium sulfide cells were internal to the camera and metered through any lens attached on the camera. This was revolutionary. Through-the-lens light metering allowed the photographer to meter the exact same light they were using to frame their scene. In addition, the Spotmatic and the Metallica teased a bayonet mount. The Spotmatic and its impressive specs caught the public's attention, and the release of a commercial product was highly anticipated. Later in 1960, the Pentax S3 was released in Japan, marketed as the H3 in the US. The camera featured a slot in the shutter speed dial to allow connectivity with the external clip-on light meters such as this one. The main upgrade from the S2 was the increased max shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second, and it contained that new cross-micro aerial image finder focus screen. In the same year, the S1 was released. That's the H1 in the US. This camera was released as the more affordable option to the S3 by having the easier to manufacture 1/500th of a second max shutter speed. But again, having a position selectable on the shutter dial for a non-guaranteed additional stop. The main advantage of the new S1 over the similar S2 was the new slot on the shutter speed dial, allowing for the clip-on external light meters. In 1962, Asahi introduced their Pentax SV, or H3V in the US, with a unique self-timer placed under the rewind crank and release button under the SV label. It also featured a high max shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second, and the frame counter would reset when opening the camera back. An interesting side fact, the V in SV apparently comes from the German word for delayed timer or self-timer, Vorlaufwerk. Also in 1962, the S1A, or H1A in the US, was released as an affordable version of the SV, having no fancy self-timer and a slower max shutter speed of 1/500th of a second. However, again the unofficial 1/1000th of a second still had a click on the dial for easier and cheaper manufacturing tolerances. Still in 1962, the Pentax Super S2 was released only in Japan as a slight improvement over the S1A. There is no super wording on the camera, however, one can determine the model by the camera containing the guaranteed 1/1000th of a second max shutter speed. Notable for this period, Asahi's first fisheye lens was released with the fixed focus Tacumar 18mm f11. This lens was the world's first diagonal fisheye lens for M42 mount cameras, and the only fisheye pancake lens. Extreme wide-angle lenses were extremely difficult to manufacture for both rangefinders and single-lens reflex cameras alike, and Pentax would be innovating in this area for years to come. Also very notable for this period, the Beatles make their debut. Turns out they become huge fans of Pentax. Seeing the Fab Four holding Pentax cameras undoubtedly increased Pentax's popularity.
When Pentax finally released the Spotmatic, it was already 1964, 4 years after the Photokina debut, and the resulting camera that was released did not have spot metering, but rather a center-weighted system. An explanation for the delayed release could be the decision to use this center-weighted averaging system. After conducting marketing research, it was discovered the difficulty of successfully using a spot-metered system. The average metering was way more user-friendly, and this decision was probably a smart one because the camera went on to be one of the most successful Pentax cameras ever. The internal metering system was activated with the switch on the side of the lens housing. The ASA was set using an inlaid dial inside the shutter speed dial. In addition, the self-timer was relocated to the front of the camera. The standard high shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second, along with internal metering at an affordable price, created one of the most mass-produced cameras of its era. Around this time, the lenses receive a major overhaul with their Super Tacumar release. The Super Tacumars promised increased light transmissivity and truer color reproduction. The Super Tacumars also improved over the Auto Tacumars by now featuring fully automatic push-pin aperture operation. That is, the aperture would automatically open once the pin was released. Another important lens at the time was the Super Tacumar 50mm f1.4. Earlier variations of the Super Tacumar had 8 elements, and it was rumored that it was released as the Zeiss Planar Killer, but it was also rumored that Pentax took a loss with every unit sold. Eventually, Pentax released a similar lens with only 7 elements that proved to be a much more profitable endeavor. See the link here to learn the differences between the 7 and 8 element Super Tacumars. Another notable lens addition was the Super Tacumar Zoom 70-150mm f4.5. This was the company's first zoom lens. The Pentax SL was released as an affordable alternative to the relatively expensive Spotmatic. This camera did not include the Spotmatic's internal light meter, but was instead sold with a new optional light meter. However, the camera did retain the 1/1000th of a second max shutter speed. Also, the Spotmatic received a major upgrade with a fully featured motor drive system. Similar motor drive systems would be released on sequential cameras. Another notable accessory would be the optional data backs, which would timestamp your photos. However, those earlier systems were quite a bit bulky. For some foreshadowing context, Ricoh, a Japanese imaging company founded in 1936, who had previously dabbled in producing rangefinder cameras in addition to lenses for other companies, joined into the universal availability of the M42 screw mount and released their own single-lens reflex in 1967 with the Ricoh Singlet TLS.
The Apollo moon landing was obviously a major world event that grabbed the attention of the entire globe. The camera used to make it to the moon? Well, it was the medium format Hasselblad. In fact, Hasselblad had been working with NASA for a few years, and that relationship substantially increased the demand for professional-level medium-format cameras. To make supply for that demand, Pentax branched off from their 35mm format in 1969 and released their 6cm by 7cm medium-format camera, conveniently called the Pentax 6x7, accepting both 120 and 220 film rolls, but at a more commercially affordable pricing compared to the very expensive Hasselblads. This allowed the average consumer to access a professional medium format quality. Just a big, beautiful camera, exceptionally fun to use with outstanding image quality results. Parts of the 6x7 modular system are shown here, including an optional waist-level viewfinder, an automatic shutter speed selector, focus screens, and filter adapters, along with a whole suite of 6x7 lenses. Impressive!
The next 35mm format camera would be released in 1971 with the Spotmatic 2, again featuring that advanced 1/1000th of a second max shutter speed and a front panel self-timer. The Spotmatic 2 featured the first flash hot shoe attached to the top of the camera pentaprism housing. In the same year, Pentax invented the world's first lens multicoating with the super multi-coated Tachymar system. Or, at least, Pentax was the first manufacturer to communicate about multi-coated lenses to the public at large. The super multi-coated lenses were very well received as having better light transmission, contrast, colors, and reduced flare than most other lenses at the time. The coating technology was that of the one used on the windows of the Apollo spacecraft, exclusive. Having this technology on consumer-quality camera lenses was mind-boggling. The impressive number of coatings apparently made some competitors doubt the Pentax claims, even stating that it wasn't necessary. Hearing the cost in relation to the effects was like shooting a sparrow with a cannon. But in the era of lenses adding multiple optical elements, increased light transmissivity was key, and multi-coatings would become necessary and would become a buzzword among all manufacturers in a short time. Super multi-coated lenses also featured a new lever on the back of the lens which can inform the camera which aperture the lens is set at. This was the feature allowing for aperture priority auto exposure and full aperture metering. Shortly after, Pentax released the second in the super multi-coated Tachymar series, simply called the SMC Tachymars. By the way, now that I've covered them all, many super multi-coated TAC, and SMC Tachymar lenses were made with thoriated optical elements. Although these lenses are radioactive, there isn't too much of a concern for a photographer unless you breathe in the ground-up thoriated glass, which I guess could happen in the manufacturing process. However, the radioactive decay would actually cause a yellowing of the glass throughout the decades, and the use of the thoriated glass in the photography industry wasn't phased out until the late 1980s. On a separate note, another important lens released around the time, the world's most efficient fisheye for 35mm format, the fisheye Tachymar 17mm f4. Prior to this lens, other fisheye lenses lost lots of light in the optical design, such as the 18mm f11 mentioned earlier. Having this new fisheye optical design capable of achieving a much wider aperture at f4 was sincerely impressive. Also, really neat seeing the built-in filters rotate into place. Also in 1971, the SP2A was released in the US market under the Honeywell brand, and also had the hot shoe with flash sync, but it also contained an additional front-facing lens to assist with Honeywell's flash accessories, and with the modified ASA selector dial. Still in 1971, but as a more affordable alternative, the SP500 was released with a slightly less tolerated max shutter speed. This allowed the camera to be manufactured for less cost. The camera displays a max shutter of 1/500th of a second, but there is still a location on the dial for the stop at 1/1000th of a second. It contains no built-in hot shoe, a lower selectable ASA, and no self-timer, which further reduced the costs. However, an optional cold shoe was available. Again in 1971, the next camera released in the Spotmatic series was the Electro Spotmatic, only released in the Japanese market. It was the world's first through-the-lens, open aperture metering, aperture priority, and auto exposure shutter mechanism. We now have aperture value mode with compatible SMC lenses. That's right, Pentax invented AV mode, and no longer a mechanical shutter, it was now fully electronic. If set in automatic mode, the camera would calculate an exposure of any value despite being on traditional stop values, and the value would be programmed for your stepless shutter. This beefier camera contained a circuit board and required a larger battery power supply than the previous models, but it had no self-timer. Had a battery checker button appearing on the top panel. It was also the first camera with an exposure compensation dial. For the American market, they'd have to wait one more year. The Electro Spotmatic would be released to the international market as simply the ES. All the same features as the original, just with the abbreviated nameplate, and apparently a more reliable electrical system too. The next three cameras were all released in 1973. Here we have the Pentax SPF. In essence, the SPF was very similar to the SP2, but now included the ability to use full aperture metering with the super multi-coated Tachymar lenses. The SPF also featured a shutter locking mechanism to prevent the camera from accidentally firing. This Spotmatic would be the pinnacle flagship for Pentax M42 mount cameras. What a beautiful layout! Fully featured at a reasonable price, the SPF would be billed as the world's best-selling interchangeable lens 35mm single lens reflex for its era. Next, the ES2 with a more compact integrated circuit for the exposure metering system. The integrated circuit improved processing speed, and with the miniaturization of the circuit board, a self-timer is now re-equipped. Last, the SB1000, sold as a more affordable option, and therefore becoming very popular and mass-produced. It had the upgraded max shutter speed from the older SP500 sibling, but it did not have the ability for open aperture metering and no self-timer as the SPF and ES series.
The next cameras released in 1975 by Pentax would be the momentous Pentax K2, KX, and KM, because with these cameras, Pentax released their first commercially available bayonet mount. For the first K-mount cameras, we'll start with the K2. This was a flagship camera of pro quality. It featured a fully automatic or manual full metal focal plane shutter for a maximum of 1/1000th of a second shutter speed at 1/125th of a second sync. Really, the K2 was a bit of an extension of the ES2 with its automatic exposure mode. The photographer would set the value of the aperture on the lens, and the camera would automatically set your shutter speed. The ASA dial was relocated to the base of the lens mount, along with the exposure compensation accessed via the ring lever. The battery check button and lamp are located on the back top left corner, along with the flash sync ports. The depth of field preview button and self-timer are on the right, and a mirror lockup lever is on the left. Next, the KX was an all-manual, flagship pro-quality camera. There is a battery check button on the top panel. The depth of field preview button is on the front panel, and a mirror lockup lever around the depth of field button. The KX was the first of many Pentaxes to come that had an aperture viewing window on the front of the body, which would reflect the lens aperture ring information into the viewfinder. This can also be called the Judas window or DX window. Here we have the KM, very similar to the flagship manual model KX, but a more affordable option. The KM was also all manual, but it didn't have the mirror lockup option, no aperture illuminator window, a reduced ASA selection range, and no shutter locking mechanism or dedicated battery checker button. Released alongside these K-series camera bodies, the first K-mount SMC lenses were released. Although no K letter appears on the lenses, this series is often referred to as the K-series lenses in the Pentax community. In addition, the name Tachymar stuck around and would be released on lenses accompanying the more affordable line of cameras. Actually, the new K-mount bayonet was likely developed through a cooperation with the company Zeiss. The two companies had been working together to create optics for eyeglasses for a couple years now, and it's believed that they were involved in developing the new Pentax lens mount. On display, we have a Zeiss and Pentax developed lens, nicknamed the Hollywood, the Pentax 28mm f2, and another example here with the 15mm f3.5. Just outstanding high-precision workmanship, with the absolute best optics around. Importantly, they release easy-to-use M42 to K-mount adapters to allow photographers to continue being able to use their previous screw-mount M42 catalog on all new Pentax bodies, a feature still maintained to this day on modern digital bodies. Interestingly, Pentax made their new K-mount royalty-free, intending the K-mount to see a universal popularity that the previous M42 mount saw. Many companies would utilize this design for their SLR cameras, including Zenit, Sears, Vivitar, Topcon, Cosina, and even Ricoh, who would produce their first K-mount SLR in 1977 with the release of the Ricoh XR1. It should be referenced that the K-mount has had notable variations throughout the years. We will not be getting into a lot of detail, as the variations mainly matter when using the film camera bodies. It should be noted that all previous era lenses will operate to some capacity on most modern digital bodies, but not all newer lenses will work with 100% functionality on the older bodies. In 1976, the K2 DMD was released, the DMD standing for Data Back and Motor Drive. This camera was incredibly feature-rich. It included exposure memory lock, a split image focusing aid, F-number illuminator in the finder, low battery voltage warning, exposure compensation warning, and a built-in eyepiece blind used to stop false light from entering the viewfinder. However, the prices of the sold separate data back and motor drive were actually pretty steep, making these incredibly rare to see in the wild. A special note on the K2 DMD. Pentax displayed a prototype K2 DMD at the 1976 Photokina called the Visitronic. This camera contained a special lens that could perform autofocus. However, the focusing sensor was external to the camera and contained on the front panel of the lens. This created quite a bulky setup and would not make it to public release. However, this prototype is proof of Pentax innovating in the field of autofocus. The 1976 K1000 was released and became the mainstay for the American student photographer. The K1000 was an affordable series similar to the SP1000. The K1000 appealed to new photography students because of its manual, down-to-basics design and affordability. It would remain popular with students for years to come. The K1000 would go on to have the longest production run in any SLR camera's history, eventually being discontinued in 1997. Impressive! An interesting side note about the K1000, although originally manufactured in Japan, manufacturing was eventually outsourced outside of Japan, such as this model of the K1000, being manufactured in Hong Kong. You can see the back panel dropped the word Japan from the Asahi Optical Company engraving, and instead used a sticker on the bottom plate for the country of manufacture. Next, the manufacturing was moved to China, and as production moved from Hong Kong to China, various cost-saving measures were taken, such as the use of some plastic instead of metal components, and the removal of the Asahi logo on the backplate entirely, in addition to being removed from the front prism housing. These manufacturing processes in different countries used various quality control measures, and therefore build qualities. Again, all variants of the K1000 were extremely mass-produced to meet the very high demand for such an excellent camera.
In the same year, 1976, the Pentax M-series cameras are released with the MX and ME. The M-series are a compact series compared to the more bulkier K-series cameras. They were competing with Olympus at the time for a battle to produce the smallest 35mm single-lens reflex. Ollie came out with the OM1, which was outstandingly small. Pentax's response to this was to release the M-series, a smaller, compact version of the K-series. First, the ME, marketed as the most compact, automatic single-lens reflex camera ever in the 35mm format. It is notable for not having a manual mode. This is the first camera to entirely eliminate manual shutter speed control, which was pretty spectacular and unheard of at the time. The camera only contained an automatic exposure AV mode. There was a mechanical flash sync of 1/100th of a second. It had an incredibly bright and beautiful viewfinder, even compared to the larger camera bodies. Second, the MX was a flagship pro camera and contained only full manual features. A very interesting side note, the M-series cameras would be known for their exceptionally large and bright viewfinders, such as the ME having a 92% coverage at 0.97 times magnification. However, at 95% coverage with 0.97 times magnification, the Pentax MX would go on to have the largest viewfinder of any Pentax 35mm camera or future digital equivalent. Not only were the camera bodies redesigned with the compact form factor, but they also reissued very compact lenses with the M-series lenses. Along with the M-series, the first Star Series lenses were released with the 300mm f4. Star Series glass are designated as top-of-the-line, professional, and highly optically corrected lenses. Just outstanding. In 1979, probably to further prove itself in the compact market, Pentax releases a new format line to compete with Minolta, who were using a 110 format film cassette. The Auto 110 was released, an ultra-miniature SLR system, the smallest single-lens reflex camera with interchangeable lenses ever sold at only 99mm wide. Although extremely compact, this camera was designed as a pocketable camera for the professional who was on the go. The camera was released with a full suite of lenses, accessories, flashes, and a winder. In 1980, the ME Super is released as an upgrade to the ME. It contained an increased electronic shutter to 1/2000th of a second and a 1/125th flash sync. In addition, it also now contained manual mode. This is also the world's first camera that came with buttons instead of dials for control of that manual shutter. Also in 1980, the MV, a lighter, more affordable model, is nearly the same feature set as the ME was released. However, it contained a smaller and reduced viewfinder. It also contained a slightly reduced ASA range and low shutter speeds. It also had no option for use with a winder and no shutter lock. An MV1 model was also released as a slightly more featured but still affordable option that contained the self-timer and the ability to attach the optional winders or motor drive.
1980 saw the release of the Pentax LX, that's Roman numeral 60, being the 60-year anniversary of Pentax. The one we show here has an aftermarket skin. This camera was released with premium model design, featuring full auto or manual shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second with a sync of 1/75th of a second. We see the exposure compensation located around the ASA dial. It has a mirror lockup, depth of field preview, and self-timer, all accessed through a multi-function lever on the right front of the camera body. Uniquely, this camera featured full dust and weather-resistant seals, not a common feature seen at the time for film cameras. In addition, the LX featured a titanium electromechanical stepless shutter, through the lens automatic flash, and the film rewind button doubled as a multi-exposure feature. Being a full-fledged premium camera, the LX was featured with a lineup of modular viewfinder attachments. The camera was available with different optional accessories, such as motor drives, battery packs, and winders. You could also access a variety of hand grips special for your needs. This impressive premium model would see a production run of more than 15 years with Pentax.
When Pentax continued the M series in 1981, they released the Pentax MG. It was very similar to the MV1 with the full auto shutter and 1/100th flash sync, but it also brought back the shutter speed indicator in the viewfinder. This camera was a very standard and expected design, which was probably intended to balance the market reaction to our next camera. Because in the same year as the MG, the MEF was released. It was released as the world's first, commercially available, through-the-lens, autofocusing single-lens reflex camera. The Pentax AF Zoom 35-70mm f2.8 was the only autofocusing lens released with this camera. It was sincerely unique and well ahead of its time. Competitors had autofocusing cameras, but those used a non-through-the-lens focusing system, which was big and bulky. Having the focusing operated through the lens allowed for an extremely compact design. It used 4 AA batteries in lens to operate the focusing. The camera was actually very similar to the ME Super, with the electronic auto and manual shutter up to 1/2000th of a second and the 1/125th flash sync, and with the shutter being selected with the buttons on the top panel. On the left next to the exposure compensation dial is actually the autofocus sound confirmation, which could be turned on or off. However, and importantly, the MEF had electrofocus, and that could be used with all the manual focus lenses. And this would use the same built-in focusing system to provide focus guidance while manually focusing. A photographer would turn the lens in the direction of an arrow in the viewfinder to help achieve focus. What a beautiful and exceptionally innovative combo. In 1982, the Auto 110 Super is released as an upgraded Auto 110. It added a self-timer and exposure compensation. Seen here with a lens trio, a flash, and a dedicated close-up attachment lens for the 24mm lens. This would be the last camera produced for the 110 film cartridge format. The Pentax Auto 110 Super had the highest quality, professional-level optics in the smallest body designs possible. In 1982, Pentax released the Pentax PC35AF, their first 35mm film compact camera, also with autofocus. This camera was the first of a whole suite of compact cameras containing the PC35 name. We aren't going to cover all the Pentax compact film cameras in this video, except for a few exceptions along the way. This would mainly include the PC, the IQ Zoom, and the SBO lines of cameras. But this market segment was very important to the bottom line of many camera manufacturers at the time.
In 1983, Pentax released the first of a new series, the A series, starting with the Pentax Super A. It was also sold as the Super program in the US. The A undoubtedly stood for automatic, because this camera was the first to contain lens electrical contacts on the bayonet mount, which could communicate automatic aperture information from the camera to the lens. This removed the need to manually set your aperture using the lens ring. The Super A would be the first Pentax camera to feature programmed exposure modes. Something interesting about this camera is that the LCD information panel appears on the top of the camera. Here, your selected shutter speed and exposure mode would appear. This information would also appear on two LCDs in the viewfinder. The LCDs were a bit harder to read in darker areas, so a button on the left side of the camera's lens mount could be pushed to allow for more light into the viewfinder. There is a self-timer lever at the top right and depth of field preview button beneath. The Super A also replaced the ASA indicator with the new but equivalent international standard for film speed called ISO. Sold with a removable hand grip for the front, and the film reminder holder on the back now incorporates a thumb grip. Pretty impressive feature set. Naturally, the Pentax A-series lenses are launched alongside the A-series camera bodies, containing the necessary electrical contacts so the lenses can communicate with the body. This contact allowed for the fully automatic aperture control, but still had no autofocus system. These A-series lenses would continue in production for the next camera series as well. The next year, in 1984, the Program A was released, also called the Program Plus in other markets. This was an affordable option to the previous Super A. This camera would have the easier to manufacture 1/1000th of a second max shutter speed with 1/100th of a second sync, and it did not contain shutter speed time value mode or through the lens flash. No top panel LCD either. However, the camera did retain the self-timer and depth of field preview lever, in addition to the large illuminator window for the viewfinder LCD panels. Again in 1984, the Pentax A3 was released, called the A3000 in other markets. This was an intriguing camera. The A3 was priced for an entry-level market containing only 1/1000th of a second max shutter speed at 1/60th of a second sync. It was fully automatic and had no manual mode, no through-the-lens flash, and no depth of field preview. However, this camera contained some impressive new features, such as a built-in automatic winder, fully dependent on two AA batteries. It was also the first Pentax to contain the new film cartridge standard DX coding, where the camera would automatically read a barcode on the film canister to inform the camera automatically what film speed to set. It featured LED backlighting in the viewfinder to increase viewfinder illumination, no longer needing the front prism window. In addition, the A3 had a separate model sold, which contained a dedicated databack. This camera would be sold as the A3 Date and an A3 Date S seen here. Still in 1984, Pentax released the Pentax 645, which shot the larger 120 film roll. This camera was not as big as their older 6x7 medium format cameras, but still much larger than 35mm format. It would be sold as the more affordable route to get to that medium format, higher image quality. The 645 featured the advanced exposure modes including program, time value, and aperture value, in addition to full manual mode. It also featured dedicated buttons to cycle through your exposure compensation, ISO settings, and mode selection. This switch allowed for both single and continuous shots with the built-in winder, featuring 1.5 frames per second. There's a separate LED illumination button for the viewfinder, and this O button would illuminate the LCD panel. Here's a tripod mounting socket for both horizontal and vertical usages, a dedicated ring to make multiple exposure shots on the side, and the depth of field preview on the right. For the 645, new 645A lenses were released for the automatic aperture, and a healthy lens catalog followed. They designed the 645 to accept the previous Pentax 6x7 medium format lenses with a simple adapter, allowing for an easier transition into the brand and format by accessing a healthy second-hand market.
In 1985, Pentax released the P-series cameras, starting with the P30 or P3 in the US. This series went back to having dials for the shutter instead of the buttons in the previous A series. This camera was simpler to use and therefore more popular than the earlier A series. However, this series still used the A series lenses. Since it was designed to be easier to use, it only had one auto program mode. Also, the camera would require DX coding on the film canister to set the ISO. This was also the first Pentax camera to feature an exposure lock button, called memory lock here, and a self-timer up top, placed within the off-on switch. And that lamp on the front is for the self-timer. In addition, depth of field preview was included, and much appreciated. The P-series also saw date variations containing a built-in databack. The following year, 1986, Pentax released the P50 or P5 in other markets. And this camera went back to having the push buttons for the shutter speed. It also included aperture value mode added back in. Also featured exposure compensation. It still used the DX canister coding to set the ISO. Notable features include this information panel to show the camera mode. Included little icons for sports or landscape mode. Again, a P50 date version was released. In 1986, the Pentax Zoom 70, the world's first compact camera equipped with a zoom lens. Displayed here is the Zoom 70S variant released sometime after, but the Zoom 70 series, innovating and mass marketing in the area of compact cameras, would become a major contributor to the Pentax bottom line. The next camera released by Pentax would be in 1987 and would be part of a new series called SF, with the SFX or SF1 in other markets. This camera is extremely well featured. This camera featured Pentax's second film autofocus feature, but instead of the in-lens focusing of the MEF, the SFX moved the focusing motor in camera for screw drive autofocus lenses. Camera had a switch for manual focus, single focus, or servo, aka continuous focus. Also, the SFX was the world's first SLR with a built-in pop-up flash. They called it the RTF, retractable through-the-lens auto flash. The SFX was also the first Pentax to be sold with relatively affordable and slim interchangeable databacks. We also have on display some see-through models, exquisite. Featured an LCD panel, off-centered hot shoe to accommodate the pop-up flash, extended shutter and ASA range. The main switch also toggles on or off the audio focus confirmation. It contained both aperture priority and shutter speed priority settings and multiple program settings, including action, normal, tele, standard wide, and depth modes. It also could be used with or without DX canister coding. To be used with the new SF cameras, the F-series lenses are released, now fully automatic with both automatic aperture and automatic screw drive focus. In addition, the F-series lenses would be completely backward compatible with the previous non-autofocusing K-mount cameras. The next camera, Pentax actually followed up from the P-series and released the P30N, or the P3N in the US. It was nearly identical to the P30 for button layout, but the AV mode was added back in. AV mode would be accessed when the shutter dial was set to A and the lens aperture ring was rotated off of the A setting. Next camera released was a follow-up to the SF series, with the SF7 or SF10 in other markets. It was released as an affordable camera with some features stripped. Had no manual ISO setting, no exposure compensation, less meter range. However, there is still an interesting LCD display panel, and the familiar dial control wheel replaced the shutter buttons. In 1989, the SFXN, or SF1N in the US, was released as an upgrade to the already highly featured SFX. It featured a faster automatic winder, auto bracketing, and a backlit top LCD display, and the fastest shutter on the Pentax yet, 1/4000th of a second. To finish off the 80s, Pentax reissued the famous 6x7 as simply the 6.7. Besides minor cosmetic changes, the new 6.7 contained mirror lockup features seen on the later releases of the regular 6x7. What a massive camera body. Look at the size of this pentaprism. You know, these 6.7 cameras produce the largest image format available to any Pentax camera. That is, the 6.7 lineup is a larger format than any future digital equivalent currently manufactured. What an absolutely outstanding camera. Also around this time, the Pentax Zoom 105 Super was released. This camera won awards for its impressive feature set, which included 1.3 frames per second continuous burst, an intervalometer, multi-exposures, step and continuous autofocus, a macro mode, adjustable flash with 5 different modes, and multiple program modes. Pretty much an advanced SLR jammed into a compact camera. In 1990, again, the manual focus P-series finishes up with the release of the P30T, T for titanium gray, nearly identical to the P30N, but with a different look and a different focus screen.
1991 saw the release of the Z series, beginning with the Z1. Pentax would re-release this camera in 1994 as a special 75th year anniversary model, seen here. The Pentax Z1, or PZ1 in the US, was a feature-packed pro-level camera that had a significantly improved autofocus system over the SF series. It innovated on the standard program mode by releasing hyper-program and hyper-manual modes, now making it possible to override any program mode with a manually selected shutter speed or aperture. This IF button would reset all your settings to a recommended program line. This is the early rendition of what we would modernly call the green button, as well as a PF button, Pentax's first user-defined function button that allowed for customized settings to be assigned to the button. There's a button on the side to pop up the flash. It also featured dual control wheels, one on the front and one on the back. Very ergonomic. The Z1 included a depth of field preview, mirror lockup, exposure bracketing, intervalometer, and both manual and DX ISO ranges. It was the first Pentax with 1/8,000th of a second max shutter speed at 1/250th of a second sync. Just an incredible piece of kit. In addition to the release of the Pentax Z1, a new series of lenses was introduced, the FA lenses. An all-new feature, the FA designation improved upon the F series by making power zoom available when equipped. More advanced usages saw an additional feature that would automatically zoom your lens to keep the subject size framed similarly throughout a continuous burst of shots while the subject approached the photographer. In 1991, the same year as the Z1, the Pentax Z10, or PZ10 in the US, was released as a more affordable option than the Z1, and thus it had some notable features removed to reduce manufacturing demands. Probably most notably, the Pentaprism was unfortunately replaced with the more affordable and less bright Pentamir viewfinder. The self-timer is found on the top panel next to the on-off switch. This camera maxed out at 1/2000th of a second shutter speed with a 1/100th of a second sync. There was only one exposure mode, and it was limited to ISO 100 with film cartridges without DX coding. The Z10 had push buttons instead of dials, and still retained the nice thumb grip on the back conveniently located next to the exposure compensation button. Pentax released the Zoom 90WR in 1991. It was the world's first weather-resistant zoom compact point-and-shoot camera. Released in 1993 was the Z20, or PZ20 in the US, an upgraded Z10 camera containing many of the great features seen in the Z1. It still only contained the entry-level Pentamir and 1/2000th of a second max shutter speed, but the camera did feature many new program modes for sport, portrait, landscape, close-up, and extra flash function for contrast control. It allowed for manual ISO entry, not dependent on DX coding. It also reintroduced time value mode along with the programmable PF mode. Also in 1993, the Z20P was released. It was exactly the same as the Z20, but included an additional panorama format option. Again seen here, demonstrating power zoom functionality with this FA 28 to 105mm lens. Once again in 1993, Pentax released their Z50P, a more affordable version of the Z20, removing many of the pre-programmed modes, but retaining the panorama format option. Also in 1994, Pentax released their Z1P. The Z1P would be the last flagship of the series, and a fan favorite for sure. It's the first to feature center-weighted metering, in addition to segment and spot. It also had a notable increase in its frames per second continuous shooting, and included the popular panorama mode in a pro-level body. In 1994, just in the Japanese market, the Z5 was released. Essentially just a Z1, but recognized for the 75th year anniversary of Pentax. In 1995, again just in Japan, Pentax released their Z5P as an upgrade to the Z5, containing Z1P features. Also in 1995, Pentax releases the Z70, or PZ70 in the US, displaying some features of the Z20, like the sport and portrait mode. However, it did not have the fancy hyper-program modes. It also featured a dial for the on-off switch. Breaking from convention, the PZ70 contained a panorama switch without the P added to the name. Likewise in 1995, the Z70P was released exactly like the Z70, and only in the Japanese market. Conventionally, the addition of the P in the name designated the included panorama format options.
In 1996, Pentax released the world's first fisheye zoom with the Pentax F fisheye zoom 17 to 28mm. In 1996, Pentax announced their new camera series, the MZ series, or ZX in the US. This series segregated the classic dials to the advanced user series, and the more modern push buttons to the entry-level easy-to-use series. So the Pentax MZ5 or ZX5 in the US, the world's smallest autofocus film single-lens reflex. It included a pentaprism viewfinder, featuring the classic dials for the shutter speed. The aperture could only be set with the aperture ring on the lens. It contained a metal bayonet mount and a 1/2000th max shutter speed. Sold as a more user-friendly and affordable camera, the MZ10 or ZX10 was sold as an affordable series. It had a plastic bayonet mount, a pentamirror instead of a pentaprism. It had no multi-exposure or spot exposure. However, it retained the more modern buttons for the shutter speed. Unlike the MZ5, it had the exposure mode set on the dial.
1997 saw Pentax begin to enter the world of digital cameras. However, they would still design and manufacture film cameras predominantly for many years. Announced at the previous year's Photokina, the Digicam Pentax EI-C90 was released as the first official digital camera manufactured by Pentax. It came with the camera section, named the EI-C90, and the monitor section, called the EI-L90. A photographer could go out shooting with the compact body alone, and then, once at home, they could reconnect the monitor and review their images. This camera stored images on PCMCIA flashcards, also known as PC cards. The EI-C90 also featured Live View in addition to a regular viewfinder. It had a built-in flash and an optional macro switch. At a launch price of $1,000 US, the 0.41 megapixel camera CCD sensor was exclusive and not heavily marketed. The manufacturing process was still very cost prohibitive. However, for being released in the year 1997, this camera was cutting edge. Also in 1997, Pentax released their APS format compatible point-and-shoot series, the Athena cameras. The front panel would slide open to expose the 24 to 48mm zoom lens. These cameras distinguished themselves from the APS competition by containing a predominant dial on the top panel, allowing quick and easy access to mode selection. Again in 1997, Pentax released the world's first film autofocus medium format camera with the 645N. This 645 has a completely reworked top panel, featuring multiple exposure modes, exposure compensation, auto bracketing selector, memory lock, and the left side contains a multiple exposure switch. The right side includes the depth of field preview lever. There is audible focus confirmation located between the off and on switch. 6 AA batteries powered a continuous burst of 2 frames per second. It accepted leaf shutter lenses to be able to access up to 0.05 of a second sync speed. The 645N was still compatible with the A-series 645 mount, but Pentax now produced a whole lineup of medium format autofocus lenses called the FA645 lenses.
In 1997, Pentax began the limited lineup of lenses with the release of the 43mm f1.9 limited. Skipping ahead a little bit, the 77mm f1.8 limited would follow in 1999 and the 31mm f1.8 limited in 2001. These pixie dust-filled three amigos are often called the three princesses and are absolutely outstanding lenses. These lenses were released as not necessarily being optically perfect, but rather producing images that are characterful and beautiful and eye-catching. Using these lenses and seeing the results give you the feeling of nostalgia. Interestingly, starting with the 43mm limited, ghostless coatings are now made available for select Pentax lenses, which significantly reduce the appearance of those annoying aberrations. In 1997, there was an upgrade to the MZ5 with the MZ5N or ZX5 and therefore retained the classic dial for the shutter speed. Had a nice pentaprism viewfinder. However, this upgrade included more features such as auto bracketing, auto exposure lock, and depth of field preview. Still only featured a max 1/2000th shutter speed, and the aperture was still set on the ring of the lens. In the same year, 1997, Pentax released the MZ3, This was a slight upgrade to the MZ5N, only available in select markets, and it featured an extended max shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second. Again in 97, an upgrade from the MZ10, and therefore containing the modernized push-button switch for selecting your settings, Pentax released the MZ50. Being more affordable, it had the pentamirror viewfinder and a plastic bayonet mount. In addition, this camera would be the first to cut power zoom from the entry-level series, and it also restricted the use of the older manual aperture lenses. However, new features such as a close-up and night scene were added to the program mode. Still in 1997, Pentax released the MZM, or the ZXM in other markets. M meaning manual focus. This camera featured among the lines of the entry-level MZ10 and MZ50 series. However, it contained the more advanced classic dial for the shutter speed. It was meant to take after the famous K1000 ancestry. In fact, the K1000 was officially discontinued in the same year. However, in a world of autofocus, it never did have the same popularity as the K1000. Being more affordable, it had a pentamirror viewfinder, a max shutter of 1/2000th of a second, and a plastic bayonet mount. It was just a stripped-down, back-to-basics affordable camera.
The last of the 6x7 format cameras was released in 1998 with the Pentax 6.7 Mark II. It featured automatic shutter selection, exposure memory lock, spot, center, and multi-metering modes, and 3 stops of exposure compensation. It also featured AV, or aperture value mode, mirror lockup, a viewfinder unlock button, a multi-exposure lever, through the lens flash, and a self-timer toggled around the off-on switch. The 6.7 II had a top panel LCD displaying settings information. There is a PS time lever. It is the time exposure set lever, and it's used in combination with the mirror lockup for long exposures. It accepted leaf shutter lenses for a sync up to 1/500th of a second, and had an extended ISO range from 6 to 6400, as well as a slow shutter speed extension down to 4 seconds. What a venerable and awesome piece of machinery.
In 1999, Pentax released the MZ7. It was released as an affordable version of the MZ5 models, with the more classic shutter speed controls and the exposure mode on the top dial. Being more affordable, it only had the max 1/2000th shutter speed and pentamirror viewfinder. Although you couldn't use power zoom, you could still set the aperture using the lens aperture ring. In the year 2000, Pentax releases the MZ30 and replaces the MZ50 line, and therefore used the more modern push-button style dials rather than the classic controls. Being affordable, it had the pentamirror viewfinder and the plastic bayonet, no power zoom or use with manual lenses, and only a 1/2000th max shutter speed. The MZ30 was the first Pentax to completely lose the ability to use K and M series lenses. This was released as a very affordable and user-friendly camera.
In the year 2000, to celebrate both the millennium and their 80th year anniversary, Pentax released a special edition reissue of the premium Pentax LX, called the Pentax LX 2000. It had the same feature set as the LX, but with that shiny LX 2000 badge. It was released with the dedicated 50mm f1.2, an exceptionally beautiful and rare camera. Also very notable for the millennium was the Pentax MZD prototype, the first full-frame Pentax digital prototype announced at Photokina 2000 and even publicly demonstrated in 2001. Apparently codenamed MR52, and apparently contained the same 6-megapixel full-frame sensor as the Contax N. However, it was just not cost-effective for this era and never went into full production. In 2000, Pentax released a fixed-lens 2-megapixel EI-2000, also known as the EI-200. It used a 1/2.7-inch CCD sensor in cooperation with Hewlett-Packard and their sister camera, the HP PhotoSmart 912. The EI-2000 featured a zoom of 34 to 108 mm in 35mm equivalent. It took CF or compact flash cards. It was powered by 4 AA batteries. The resolution of all these cameras seemed a bit short compared to the resolving power of analog film, and therefore was quite prohibitive in many applications. However, not needing to use film or develop images was very attractive for many photographers, and it would become quite popular. The electronic point-and-shoot series would continue on, with many variations, under the Optio name. We aren't going to cover them all here, and I'll stick mainly to the SLR cameras. This includes skipping over the bridge-like cameras, which contained a smaller sensor, but allowed for a hyperzoom fixed lens. In 2001, the last Pentax medium format film camera, the Pentax 645N Mark II, is released. It had a very similar feature set to the 645N, however the autofocus module was greatly improved. In addition, the 645N Mark II contained mirror lockup and an extended slow shutter speed range and exposure compensation range. The same lens adapter that was released with the 645N also allowed the Mark II to access the larger 6x7 lenses. What an outstanding and beautiful camera, just top-notch.
In 2001, the MZ6, released with various names in other markets, replaced the MZ7 with the more classic shutter speed control dials. Being more affordable, it had the pentamirror and reduced lens function with no power zoom and restricted use with manual lenses. However, new features included a higher max shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second. Also in 2001, the MZS was released. This was a serious flagship camera from Pentax. It was designed for the advanced professional user. It had the classic analog control wheels and a nice bright pentaprism viewfinder. Max shutter speed was increased to 1/6000th of a second. Being an advanced model, it contained the power zoom features and the ability to use manual aperture lenses. In addition, the MZS was the first to exhibit the new PTTL, Pentax Through the Lens Flash system. In 2002, Asahi Optical Company changes their name to become the Pentax Corporation. And still in 2002, Pentax released the MZ60, and this was the more easier to use, modern style camera with a pentamirror viewfinder and a max shutter of 1/2000th of a second. Had no depth of field preview, no exposure compensation, but it had a mirror lockup feature, exposure bracketing, and through the lens flash. And it also retained the full power zoom features and the ability to use manual aperture on your lens.
In 2003, Pentax released their very last film camera series, the Pentax Starist. Features included a new and improved 11-point autofocus with continuous, single, and manual focus options, a 1/4000th of a second max shutter speed, depth of field preview, and a substantial back panel LCD. It also had a mid-roll rewind button for multiple exposures, auto bracketing, and an auto exposure lock button. Although it was a good camera, they sold in low quantities, mainly because it was a film camera in the world of digital cameras. 3 FA-J lenses are released in 2003 as affordable alternatives to the FA line. Later in 2003, Pentax entered the digital interchangeable SLR market with a digital version of the just previously released Starist film camera. They called their new digital camera the Pentax Starist D. The Starist D featured, as expected, a feature-rich customer rewarding experience with a bright pentaprism viewfinder. It featured 11 autofocus points, 3200 ISO, and through the lens flash. To save images, this camera used compact flash cards. All other subsequent Pentax digital single lens reflex would use SD cards instead. It also featured a 6-megapixel CCD sensor, which was a lot of megapixels back then, and the Starist D was presented as a professional high-end camera. The 6-megapixel cameras were awesome, with their beautiful sensor color renditions. Shout out to the 6-megapixel club, a very loud and proud community still active to this day. A comment on the K-mount. Because 35mm full-frame sensors were still cost-prohibitive at the beginning of the digital era, most camera manufacturers decided a cropped sensor was necessary. Similarly, the Starist D had a 23.5 by 15.7mm sensor. Pentax, being loyal to their fan base, didn't change their mount size and kept with the K-mount, allowing full compatibility for future digital cameras. Along with the smaller sensors, smaller lenses were also manufactured in the K-mount. They were given the designation of DA. Also, Pentax released the DA 16 to 45mm, the first time quick shift is implemented in a Pentax lens, which allowed for full-time manual focus override. Around this time, Pentax also releases the DFA series with the DFA 50mm f2.8 and 100mm f2.8 macro lenses. These are digital era lenses with a full frame image circle. Pentax billed this series as being compatible with both film and digital cameras. However, many understood this new series to mean that Pentax had begun working on a full frame digital camera. In 2004, Pentax released a more affordable version of the Starist D, the Starist DS. This camera replaced many features that had physical buttons on the Starist D, and instead moved them into the menu system of the Starist DS, allowing for less manufacturing and assembly and a more affordable process. The camera still featured a 1/4000th of a second max shutter speed and pentaprism viewfinder, along with the 11 autofocus points and through the lens flash. It allowed for continuous autofocus when the mode was set to moving objects program. In the next year, 2005, Pentax released a minor upgrade to the Staris DS by introducing the Pentax Staris DS2. The main upgrades included a larger LCD panel, and the camera allowed for continuous autofocus to be set in any mode or program. The camera retained the 11 autofocus points and the ability to use through-the-lens flash. Very notably, Pentax had begun working in partnership with the company Samsung. The two companies had been working together sharing technology, and when Pentax released the Staris DS2, Samsung released a sister camera called the Samsung GX1S. In the same year, 2005, Pentax released a much more affordable model, the Pentax Starist DL. This camera contained a pentamirror viewfinder and removed the through-the-lens flash for only p-TTL support. In addition, the focusing system was reduced to only 3 autofocus points. 2006 would see the last of the Staris series, with the Starist DL2. This camera was a slight upgrade from the Starist DL. Again, only containing a pentamirror viewfinder, the main feature upgrades included electronic image preview, depth of field preview, and an increase to 5 autofocus points. Also notable, another Samsung sister camera was released with the Samsung GX1L. Exact same feature sets, just in a different cosmetic body. Also on display here are the Samsung equivalent kit lenses with the Schneider Kreuznach 18 to 55 mm, and here with the 55 to 200 mm.
In 2006, the Pentax K10D would be released as the first of the digital K series. These cameras featured weather sealing and in-camera sensor dust removal. These DSLRs have built-in shake reduction, which Pentax would end up being very well known for. Samsung released their own version with the GX10. Again, the feature set is exactly the same as the Pentax sister camera, but with only cosmetic, aesthetic differences between the two.
Pentax releases the world's first APS-C fisheye zoom lens with the DA 10 to 17 mm. This zoom fisheye really is a hallmark of the outstanding history of Pentax innovating in the field of ultra-wide-angle optics.
The K10D featured the first body compatible with the silent focusing SDM motors, a deviation from the previous screw drive autofocus. However, the first lenses released with the SDM motor were also released with a screw drive motor for compatibility. In 2006, Pentax released the K100D. It was a more affordable variation and it was only 6 megapixels. The K100D, being more affordable, didn't support the SDM autofocus, and the pentaprism viewfinder was replaced for a pentamirror. Still, at only 6 megapixels, this camera's CCD sensor produces lovely, colorful images. Also in 2006, the K110D is released as the exact same as the K100D, using the same 6 megapixel sensor, but it was slightly more affordable as it didn't have shake reduction. Not a bad option if you need an affordable camera and knew you didn't need the extra stabilization support. This camera was feature-packed. In 2007, the K100D Super was released. It was very similar to the K100D with its feature set and in-body shape reduction, but the K100D Super also reintroduced the SDM autofocusing ability. Quite an excellent camera. Also released was the more affordable DAL series lenses. Pentax continued to work with Samsung, and in 2008 they released the pro-level K20D, an upgraded 14.6 megapixel sensor now fitted with the fancy CMOS sensor type. On top of the in-body shake reduction and weather sealings, the K20D also saw the first edition of Live View. Again with both Pentax and Samsung offspring.
So apparently, around the year 2007, Pentax Corporation began seeking a stock swap, and this rumored to include the camera business being sold off. The then president of Pentax resigned over the matter. The rumors turned out to be true. The company Hoya completed the purchase of Pentax. Apparently, the sale completed for about 10% greater than the market value, and the Hoya CEO was heavily scolded for this decision, which was seen by some as a mistake. Speculatively, Hoya originally purchased Pentax to bolster its medical-related business, with the intent to eventually sell off the camera imaging departments. In the end, they do sell the brand in less than 4 years, but will retain the rights to use the name Pentax for their medical equipment.
Next, in 2008, Pentax releases the K200D. Being a more affordable offering, the camera only had a pentamirror viewfinder and a 10-megapixel CCD sensor. However, the K200D contains some more advanced features, such as weather sealings and the ability to accept a battery grip. Although priced as an affordable camera, this camera is extremely capable and produces outstanding color renditions. In 2009, Pentax released the 10-megapixel KM, also called the K2000 in the United States. This was released as the world's smallest digital single-lens reflex equipped with an APS-C size sensor. The K2000 was a digital acknowledgement for Pentax's anniversary of the K1000. It was released as an affordable camera and therefore had a pentamirror viewfinder. However, it retained SDM focusing.
In 2009, Hoya offers the Pentax K7, utilizing the same 14-megapixel CMOS sensor as the K20D. But pretty much everything else was visually and mechanically renewed. The K7 included a dustproof and weather-resistant body, a nearly 100% field of view pentaprism viewfinder, and an all-new autofocus system. The K7 was the first Pentax DSLR to add video functions with a 720p HD format. It also included a redesigned control panel, a bigger LCD, and all of this was in a more compact body. Around this time, we see the release of the APS-C format limited lenses. These were highly regarded characterful lenses with similar appreciation and style as the full-frame limited lenses. Seen here are the full range of APS-C limited lenses to be released. 2009 saw the release of the Pentax KX, an affordable version of the K7. This camera contained a 12.4 megapixel CMOS sensor behind one of the most compact DSLR offerings ever. This DSLR was also one of the first to offer over 100 color variations. Although affordability was the goal, with no weather seals, reduced megapixels, and lower max shutter speed, this camera was a high ISO queen, not only extending the upper ISO range to 12,800, but it produced cleaner images at the lower ISOs as well. Outstanding! Also in 2009, Hoya added to the DFA line with the release of the Pentax DFA 100mm WR macro, still without a full-frame camera to use it with. Again, this lens contained a full-frame image circle, further hinting at the possibility that Pentax was working on their own full-frame digital camera. In 2010, Hoya offers the K5, which is visually very similar to the K7, but with a different sensor, the same 16.3 megapixel Sony sensor as in the Nikon D7000. This improvement controlled sensor noise much better, which in turn increased image quality substantially. The K5 was the first Pentax DSLR to support full HD 1080p video capture function. In addition, the autofocus system calculations, and therefore speed, was substantially improved. Being a flagship camera in this series, the K5 also had weather sealing. An incredible accessory is released at this time, the OGPS-1. This unit not only allows you to geotag your images, but Pentax also tapped the in-body stabilized sensor to innovate astrotracer technology. This feature would acquire your geographic location and rotate your in-body stabilized sensor at a rate relative to the star's apparent rotation above you. This allowed for long exposure astrophotography, a unique and astounding feature released for Pentax digital single lens reflex cameras. Also in 2010, the more affordable KR is released after the K5 with a slightly reduced 12 megapixel sensor, a lower max shutter speed of 1/6000th of a second, and a slightly lower high ISO limit. Similar to the KX, no weather sealings were present on the KR. Although the KR had similar megapixels to the KX, it did have other advantages. The KR contained a larger LCD, faster frames per second continuous burst, and an increased high ISO range, albeit in a slightly larger body.
In 2010, Hoya releases the Pentax 645D. The 645D was and still is an extremely impressive camera. This camera is the largest CCD sensor medium format that Pentax would ever produce. In addition to that, the 645D would be produced without an anti-aliasing low-pass filter, which was commonly installed on other cameras to remove the effects of moire. However, removing this filter would allow the camera to capture extremely fine detail and increase resolution. Coupled with just outstanding color rendition, this camera is capable of producing some of the best images ever. The 645D was released with a new line of digital 645 lenses called the DA645. which built off of the A and FA film era 645 lenses. It could even be adapted to use the larger 6.7 medium format lenses. A digital era, medium format camera, capable of accessing a native catalog built over 40 years, is an extremely attractive entry for new photographers. Around this time, the lenses also see the first Aero Bright coatings and SP Super Protect coatings.
In 2011, Hoya releases the Pentax Q. This exceptional camera would be Pentax's first foray into the mirrorless world, well before the mirrorless fad of other brands. This miniature camera was probably designed to help compete against compact smartphone cameras that were becoming more common. This camera was equipped with a 1/2.3-inch, 12.4 megapixel CMOS sensor and was billed as the world's smallest and lightest interchangeable lens camera. Containing a full metal body made available in 2 colors, the Q was launched under the new functional beauty design paradigm that could be described as seeking pleasant minimalism, a trend seen in subsequent cameras as well. To support the smaller format, the Q used the miniature Q-mount lenses. This included the release of a K-mount lens adapter for the Q. After only owning Pentax for about 4 years, in 2011, Hoya sells the Pentax imaging departments to Ricoh, who purchases all shares of Pentax Imaging Corporation. This deal includes the rights to manufacture and produce cameras under the Pentax brand name. Ricoh, an older Japanese company that shared much of its history with the Asahi Pentax brand, purchased the Pentax company with the intent to build cameras, to honor the Pentax name, history, and legacy, and to preserve the customer loyalty the brand had built over time. The new company would be called Pentax Ricoh Imaging Company, however they'd keep this name for only about a year. In 2012, the Pentax K5 Mark II greatly improved upon the K5 autofocus system with its focus sensitivity range, and in addition, the K5 Mark II provided a much improved LCD, improving both quality and its compact appearance. Besides those improvements, the body and specifications remain the same. Released alongside the Pentax K5 Mark II, the Pentax K5 Mark II-S version was only $100 more MSRP, but importantly, like the previous impressive 645D, the K5 Mark II-S came without the anti-aliasing filter, meaning those cameras were capable of acquiring extra fine resolution. Going forward after the release of the K5 Mark II-S, all anti-aliasing filters were removed from flagship cameras to enhance image quality, and Pentax would soon have a technological innovation within this field. In 2012, the Pentax K30 is released as the entry-level K5 offspring. This camera was offered at entry-level prices, but was certainly feature-rich compared to the competitors. To have weather sealings and in-body image shake reduction on an entry-level body is quite exceptional. In addition, the K30 had dual control wheels, another advanced camera feature for this entry-level offering. It has a pretty large LCD and advancements in autofocus tracking too. However, the K30 was the first entry-level camera to contain the ill-fated green solenoid that may cause aperture block failure. Unfortunately, though substantially improved through the years, this issue persisted with Pentax entry-level cameras. 2012 saw the release of the extremely compact Pentax K01 K-mount mirrorless camera, a signature piece of its time, designed in partnership with the world-renowned industrial designer Mark Newson. This camera has the same 16-megapixel CMOS sensor as the DSLR K30. The K01 allowed for many of the technological benefits of modern mirrorless cameras. Again, it was much before its time. New age and minimalistic, yet fully featured. An exceptional camera indeed. You should check out the K-mount DA 40mm f2.8 XS lens that was released along with the K01. It's only 9.3 millimeters thick and is ridiculously sharp and impressively affordable. In fact, this lens has the exact same optical formula as the 40mm limited lens. 2012 saw an update to the Q with the Pentax Q10. This camera was basically the original Q, but with a plastic body and much better ergonomics, including a new grip and new overall design. And true to the time, this camera came available with more than 100 color variations. Also in 2012, Pentax released their HD coatings, more durable than the Aero Bright, but easier to make, with equitable light transmissivity. 2013 saw the release of the K50, again an entry-level DSLR, which had a pentaprism viewfinder in the mainstream market. Along with its dust and weather-resistant seals, It also contained an extended ISO range. This camera stood out from the pack, exceptional in its feature set offerings. Again in 2013, the more affordable K500 was released. It was nearly the same as the K50, but sold more affordably without the weather sealings, making this model very affordable with beginner-level pricing, but still a feature-packed camera. Also in 2013, Pentax released an upgrade to the Q line with the Pentax Q7. It had the same body as the Pentax Q10, but with a notably larger sensor. Instead of the previous 1/2.3-inch 12.4 megapixel in the Q10, the new Q7 was equipped with an extended ISO range and 1/1.7-inch backlit CMOS sensor, but still in an exceptionally small body that accepted the same Q-mount lenses. Exquisite.
In 2013, Pentax Ricoh Imaging Company changed their name to simply Ricoh Imaging Company. They released the new flagship APS-C DSLR with the Pentax K3, featuring the world's first AA anti-aliasing simulator function. That is, Pentax used the in-body image stabilized sensor to produce an effect similar to having an optical AA filter over the sensor. This allows for the best options of both worlds when it comes to AA filters and moire correction options. The K3 contained an all-new 24 megapixel sensor, a big jump up from the previous K5s with the 16 megapixels. Included an all-new focusing engine with 27 focus points and 8.3 frames per second in continuous shooting. Also, Pentax Flu SD cards are made available, now allowing for external wireless image transfer and remote camera control. Shake reduction, weather sealing, and a pop-up flash, and a larger LCD display. Just a complete and impressive overhaul to create this truly impressive piece of kit. Next in 2014, an update to the Q line. The Q-S1 was released. The feature specs are nearly identical to the previous Q7, but with slight improvements and a substantially reworked physical appearance. The main differences has been the addition of continuous focus in movie mode. The look of the camera has been completely revamped, and it's an incredibly fun and versatile camera to have in the bag. In the same year, the KS1 is released. This was a special series camera that seemed to sell between the entry-level and the enthusiast-level DSLR. Featured a CMOS sensor at 20 megapixels. Unfortunately, like the K500, the KS1 did not retain weather sealings, and further yet, only one control wheel. However, this camera was extremely capable and very relatable to other brands' entry-level stats, so the improved sensor and feature set sold for a very compelling piece of kit. In addition, the KS1 was a stylized accessory with 12 colors to choose from. Also in 2014, the 645Z is launched as a 51.4 megapixel CMOS professional level medium format camera, and the first medium format camera capable of live view monitoring. It's also the first Pentax medium format to feature movie mode. The camera has a substantially improved burst rate from 3 frames per second compared to the 645D at 1.1 frames per second. Just an outstanding, high image quality producing machine. 2015 saw the release of the KS2. Similar to the KS1, the KS2 had a neat 20 megapixel sensor, but included dual control wheels and an articulating screen and was fully weather sealed. The KS2 was also the first Pentax to contain internal, built-in Wi-Fi for image transfer and camera control. Again being priced and featured between the other brand's entry-level and enthusiast-level DSLR offerings, this camera was very compelling offering for new and ambitious photographers alike. In 2015, Ricoh released an update to the Pentax K3 with the K3 Mark II. It's very similar to the K3, but instead of an external flash, the camera was equipped with an internal GPS unit. Being a flagship camera, the K3 Mark II contained the best weather sealings of any DSLR around. In addition, the K3 Mark II introduced pixel shift technology. Pentax again tapped into that floating in-body image stabilized sensor shake reduction, where a single press of the shutter would capture 4 images, exactly 1 pixel up, 1 pixel over, and 1 pixel down, and combine them for an ultra high resolution and color corrected image.
Monumentally in 2016, Ricoh released the Pentax K1 with their first 35mm full-frame digital SLR camera. At 36 megapixels, the K1 is an impressively feature-rich offering for its reasonable price. The first Pentax digital camera to capture the full image circle of an extensive history of lens offerings. Outstanding. The K1 featured an all-new 5-axis shake reduction system called SR2, lots of customizable buttons, internal Wi-Fi, and a unique Space Lander articulating LCD screen. Appreciatively, a third control wheel was added. Overall, the K1 was a next-level high-end quality camera. Here, Pentax releases a new autofocus motor called PLM, or Pulse Linear Motor. This may be a focus-by-wire autofocus system, but the results are lightning fast with ultra-accurate results. It was first released here with the DA 55 to 300mm PLM, also seen with the new retractable lens barrel design. Around this time was the release of 2 more full-frame image circle lenses. Notable with these lenses, the new DFA Star 70 to 200mm is the first lens to feature new AeroBrite 2 nano coatings. Also in 2016, Ricoh released the Pentax K70, an entry-level option and update from the K50 that also incorporated many elements from the previous KS2. Furthering the tradition of putting a high-end tech into entry-level bodies, the K70 features not only include a pentaprism viewfinder, full-body weather sealing, dual control wheels, and 24 megapixels, but the K70 is also now equipped with pixel shift, internal Wi-Fi, and 14-bit RAW capture. In 2017, Ricoh announced the exquisite Pentax KP, a high-end APS-C offering in a modern, stylized, slim body with a nod to vintage designs. The 24-megapixel KP contained an additional mode dial on the top panel, which would work in conjunction with a third control wheel. An excellent and fun-to-use camera with a nice articulating screen, the KP was sold with 3 various-sized interchangeable hand grips. A beautiful fan-favorite camera for sure. In 2018, Ricoh released the Pentax K1 Mark II, along with a completely novel hardware update program. You could send in your K1 Mark I, and they would upgrade the chipset to that of the new K1 Mark II. These feature enhancements included a new accelerator unit for improved noise handling at high ISO. Indeed, the K1 Mark II has 2 stops added to the high-end ISO range. Also, Pixel Shift 2 is introduced, which allows for handheld pixel shift operation. The K1 Mark II also had improvements to its focusing system and subject tracking. This camera is an absolute unit, with superb image quality, an impressive feature set, and the ability to natively access the entire catalog of full-frame Pentax glass, an excellent addition to the Pentax lineup. Also notable, Pentax releases an updated version of the 10 to 17mm fisheye zoom with the improved HD coatings in addition to a removable lens hood. In our opinion, this lens represents the epitome and legacy of Pentax history. A loyal nod all the way back to the first ever SLR wide-angle tachymar, the first ever fisheye tack, the most efficient fisheye tack, the first fisheye zoom, and the first APS-C fisheye zoom, all leading class, innovative, and impressive optics in their field.
November 27th, 2019 marks the 100-year anniversary of the foundation of the Asahi Optical Joint Stock Co., the original manufacturer of all Pentax brand products. To hallmark the occasion, Pentax released special 100-year anniversary memorabilia, such as this iconic hot shoe, body cap, and shoulder strap. In 2020, Ricoh announced that Pentax believes in the future of SLR photography, and they release a 5-point principle statement for Pentax. That is, statements of the 5 principles that express the philosophy of Pentax and their mission directive. We design new cameras through sheer devotion.
It is our intention to produce cameras that will be the preferred choice for photo enthusiasts because we love photography and we have an in-depth knowledge and understanding of cameras.
Our goal is to produce cameras with the power to capture images that allow for direct communication with the subject.
We intend to design cameras that create memorable images, that make us feel as if we're connecting directly with the subject, capturing our imagination and captivating our senses.
We design cameras that allow our users to enjoy all the processes involved in taking a picture.
We pursue every essential element involved in the joy of photography, from looking through the viewfinder to composing the image, focusing on the subject and releasing the shutter.
We pursue a level of quality and performance that can't be measured by numbers alone.
We produce our cameras not only by pursuing higher performance based on numerical values, but by integrating our designers' sensory feedback into the design and development.
We respect and value the photographic experience of our users and view this as an invaluable asset.
We want to share all the inspiring experiences of our users, from the hardware to the shooting processes, creating and viewing the images.
In 2021, Pentax releases the Pentax K3 Mark III, their first DSLR released after their 5-point statement and mission directive, signaling a new era for Pentax cameras. The K3 Mark III featured an all-new sensor at 25.7 megapixels. The imaging computer has been entirely revamped to include a 101-point autofocusing system. The system works in conjunction with an ultra-high-resolution exposure metering system to provide subject recognition, including the ability to track a subject's eyes through the optical viewfinder. Pretty impressive. However, probably most impressive because Pentax's dedication to the optical viewfinder. The viewfinder equipped on the K3 Mark III is absolutely stunning. The view is so large that it is similar to that of using a full-frame camera. Being able to see crystal clear through your camera, as you would with your regular eye, and not delayed through an electronic finder is the backbone of this camera, and Pentax definitely delivered. Weather seals, shake reduction, AA simulator, pixel shift, 12 frames per second in continuous shooting, 3 control wheels, top-notch ergonomics, extended high ISO, electronic high-speed shutter, internal charging, and the first Pentax to feature 4K video resolution. Outstanding. The K3 Mark III has lived up to the Pentax mission directive. They are being true and loyal to what the brand has always stood for. In addition to impressive spec sheets and high-quality imagery, Pentax recognizes and values the user experience and appreciation of the entire photo-taking process. We love using these cameras, and we are incredibly excited to see what the future holds for Pentax. Thank you for watching our History of Pentax video. We'd like to extend a special thanks to Luis Salazar. This project would not have even started without his support. So if you want to show your appreciation for this video, please go to his Instagram, @SpacemanLou, and send your love his way. And another big thanks to Adam and the entire Pentax Forums community, especially to our many contributors. You've all been an endless source of knowledge and entertainment. Thank you. If you like this content and would like to see more like it, please like and subscribe. Thanks.